Dear faculty, students, ladies and gentlemen, we are here to celebrate the arrival of a new professor at the Diplomatic Academy. And for the first time, it is a professor of our permanent resident faculty who is at the same time professor at the University of Vienna. This is something which is new for both institutions. It is something we took quite a long time to achieve. We are proud that we managed, and we're proud that this is the day where we can present to you the new professor which was chosen by both institutions. The inaugural lecture tonight will be on EU foreign policy in a new era, the internal-external nexus revisited. And the professor who is giving you this lecture is one of those who spent all his career so far on European foreign policy with all its ups and downs, looking into mainly also the consequences what it meant for third parties, for the international order, what it meant for specific conflicts. I could quote you a lot from his papers and book contributions on issues like Middle East, but also climate policy, but also environmental policy, but also, for instance, Australian models of the use of the carbon dioxide, I think it was, within the international system. And so you might expect that this lecture will give you quite a vivid picture in how difficult European studies are. But for this institution, for the Academy, Diplomatic Academy, it is actually a great day to have a permanent professor of European studies. We do feel that this is a necessary extension of our academic work, and it's also an extension of our research activities. And I could again give you a lot of information about Professor Müller's contribution also to research on European studies. That he is involved in European research projects, in various projects ongoing, and he has been involved already. But let me give you a little bit of an idea of where he comes from. Actually, Patrick Müller has been educated firstly in Munich, and later on only at the University of Vienna. And you might hear from the way he speaks that he is one of those migrants that we happily accept at such an international place. He comes from one of the biggest migrant groups that we have in Austria. And Patrick Müller then went on also to have his habilitation at the University of Vienna. But he, as so many of his generation, had also the chance to go abroad on various occasions. So he was in Jerusalem for quite a few months. He was in Paris for quite some time, doing research and also teaching. He was in Washington with Johns Hopkins for quite some time before he became in Spain, or should I say in the Basque territory, the Basque region, permanent fellow of the Basque University in Bilbao. And he also has an experience already in Vienna as a researcher and lecturer because he was assistant professor at the Institute for European Integration Research at the University of Vienna, which used to be part of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. With all this background, we are very much looking forward to his time here at the Academy, and we wish him all the best and try to give him the support that is possible for us. And I'm personally very happy that Patrick Müller is also someone who knows that teaching to us is one thing. Telling the public about what we are doing and why we are doing, and what it may mean for real life, for the practical life of international relations, is a second thing, and at least as important. And Patrick Müller is a contributor to various international magazines, newspapers. He gives comments on EU foreign policy issues. I'm not sure how convinced he is always of what he's saying on EU foreign policy, because already the title of his inaugural lecture gives you the idea that things are in flux. He revisits the internal-external nexus. And I remember the first time I thought about this in a real serious way was the 24th of June, 2016. Because on this day, two things happened at the same time. We knew the result of the referendum in the United Kingdom on the morning of this day. And a few hours later, the High Representative of the European Union, Margherita Mogherini, presented the EU global strategy. And it's interesting to note that there was a discussion on this morning of 24th in Brussels, whether this should be done on this very day. Because the fear was that it might interfere with everything the public, but not only the public, but also the political scene was talking immediately after the surprising result of the Brexit referendum. The decision was by the European Union to stick to presenting the global strategy with all the problems that we know are part of trying to make the European Union competitive now. At least questions of EU foreign policy, and you are following it more deeply than I do, can be found every day now. You may remember that within the last few months and even few days, a lot of European politicians again asked for an end to unanimity decisions for fundamental issues of EU foreign policy. They asked for majority voting. Among them was Manfred Weber, who has a fair chance to become the next president of the EU Commission. So maybe Patrick Müller is right. Maybe this is a new era. I will listen carefully to what he has to say, and I'm looking forward to what he will do with all of us in the coming years. I wish him, on behalf of the Diplomatic Academy, the best for this, and give the floor to Patrick Müller.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Briggs, for this very warm welcome. And I also have to say I'm very happy to do this lecture in English, so you would not hear my German accent that strongly. It's an honor and a pleasure to give my inaugural lecture here at this distinguished institution. I would also like to thank in my own name the faculty, the team here at the Diplomatic Academy, Professor Rosenberger, who joins from Vienna University, and of course all the distinguished guests and students who join today. And as the joint professor for European Studies, both at the university and here at the Diplomatic Academy, it's always a nice occasion also to bring people together, and that's also something very nice about this particular event. An knowledgeable insider, when I was even more new than I am now to the Academy, described the Diplomatic Academy to me as a happy ship. And so I would like to use the occasion again to thank the captain and the fantastic crew to take me on board and for the warm welcome over the past 3 months. I started this position in October, so when the trimester was just starting, so I think we all hit the ground running, but it has been a real pleasure to be on board. And let me now bridge from a complex constellation that is a joint professorship to a probably even more complex constellation, the European Union. And I think we all, when we inquired about the state of the European Union over the past years, we would encounter images like this. A euro currency that's crumbling, a European star that's fading away or dropping out of the banner, or cartoons like the one at the bottom below, where you have countries like Portugal, Ireland, and Greece, I guess it's the beginning of the financial crisis here, who act almost like a ticking time bomb that threatens to blow the European project apart. And if you go beyond now media images and you look at the strategic discourse, and in all his foresight, Ambassador Briggs has already alluded to the 2016 global strategy, you see that this image of a European Union in crisis is also quite prominent in Europe's own discourse. So the introduction states that we live in times of existential crisis within and beyond the European Union, and that our union is under threat. It continues saying that the European project, which has brought unprecedented peace and prosperity and democracy, is being questioned. And interestingly, if you go back in time, this view of a double crisis in Europe, so that you have severe external challenges whilst you're facing also severe challenges internally, contrasts quite notably with the vision that the European Union gave itself in its external relations just about a decade earlier, in 2003, when the European security strategy was launched, very much the predecessor of today's global strategy, and it was stating that Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free, and the violence of the first half of the 20th century has given way to a period of peace and stability unprecedented in European history. And it continues saying, well, we have an increasing convergence in European interests and the strengthening of mutual solidarity. So it sounds quite distant from today's perspective. And in a big European research network I was putting together with a colleague from Germany, Professor Michel Knott, we started out mapping now both the challenges the European Union is facing internally and external challenges. And it was an almost surreal picture that came out of this basic mapping exercise, because it's just so many things that happen at once. I guess everybody remembers what 2 days ago happened in the UK Parliament, so we know Brexit will not go away fastly. There's a financial crisis that is still continuing. It has still repercussions. We have a migration and refugee crisis. Populism is on the rise, and the extreme right, and so is Euroscepticism. And the European Union has to deal with all these matters whilst facing severe external challenges at the same time. American foreign policy that has become less predictable, conflicts in the neighborhoods, one of the most violent conflicts of today that we have in Syria. You have changes in global power constellations, the rise of China, a decline of liberal democracy, a liberal global order and regimes that become under increasing pressure. And you have ongoing challenges that will be also with us for some more time, of course, like global environmental challenges. And this raises a serious set, of course, of questions how you want to study European foreign policy in this new era, if you want, or when you face these new realities. And of course, I cannot deal with the host of questions it raises, and I would like to limit myself to two issues mainly. And one issue would be, what do these internal crises do to the Europeans' capacity for foreign policy making? So here you really talk about the internal dimension. Now, on what kind of issues can you agree when you are in conflict on so many levels within Europe? And then, of course, there's another question. How do you deal with those new external challenges also in the neighborhood? Do you require new policy tools for that? Can you do it on the basis of existing instruments? So that would be kind of a second set of issues that's quite important to look at. If we start with how scholars long approached the first question, Well, it very much focused on what you see on the left of this picture. So on member states forging a common foreign policy, more and more tools shifted to the European level. So you talked about this process of integration in foreign policy, and policy making is something that you call Europeanization. So we have quite a extensive output of foreign policies. Institutions grow and get strengthened over time. And a puzzle for research resulting from this was very much how do we see that we can, or how can we agree on so many things in an area that is so intergovernmental. We have unanimity decision-making in the core areas of foreign policy, so the common foreign and security policy, and scholars wondered, well, how can we agree on substantive outputs if it's so constrained a mode of decision-making? So that was really what scholars over the past 15 years or so were interested in. And for those less familiar with foreign policy, so it starts in the 1970s as a loose framework for diplomatic coordination, and then it's integrated in the European Union's infrastructure. You have a Foreign Affairs Council where the foreign ministers meet, where important decisions are taken. They meet quite frequently, and this is supported by a huge structure of committees, of working groups that deal with, on the one hand, geographic regions that Europe takes an interest with, but also, of course, substantive issues like non-proliferation, etc. We today have an external action service, a diplomatic service of the European Union, and we have a high representative. It's not a foreign minister, it's a high representative who also double heads as president of the European Commission, which is important because it connects also important foreign policy tools. So we have this institutional development, and at the same time, there's agreement on, we have 16 ongoing CSDP missions. Some of them are civilian, some of them military, 18 missions completed. So it's not that you agree only on shallow things, but you agree on very substantive matters of foreign policy. And another interesting trend that the scholars observed was that if you look at member states, you see interesting processes of convergence over time. And a colleague of us from Vienna, Paul Louis, did a study where he looked at voting behavior of UN member states in the General Assembly and how much consensus you can see in their voting behavior. And the more consensus pushes the line upward. So the pink line here being all recorded votes, and the blue line issues related to the Middle East. Now, and if you want to get a trend in, you would have a line that goes upward. So over time, you have also this convergence. You see it in the voting behavior. And scholars wondered how you really can explain this looking at formal institutions, at formal rules, and going to Brussels and doing a lot of interviews. What really came out is that you have also to look at informal practices. And these have been quite important to facilitate policymaking in this very intergovernmental realm. What kind of practices am I talking about? Well, one is a practice of consultation. So if you are dealing with important foreign policy matters, before you issue an important statement at the national level, you should coordinate with your colleagues in Brussels. You should not just set policy precedents without consultation. There's also a culture of seeking consensus. So you can become quite isolated in these deliberations if you insist on narrowly defined national interests. So there is this element of maintaining flexibility. And then there's a third norm, and this is the consistency norm. So what you try to do is that you respect previously agreed policy positions. Many diplomats you talk to in Brussels, they call it something like agreed language. And you wouldn't want to untie this agreed language. And interestingly, Ambassador Briggs has noted on an occasion, this can also be probably at times problematic. Now, when you agree on a position like Brexit and have very few flexibility left to untie it again. But as we know, Brexit can turn quite a few things on its head. And so far, it's a principle that has served quite well European foreign policy making. And then it has been important that national diplomats enjoy quite a bit of discretion when they take foreign policy. So often they are not constrained by mandates too strictly to give them the flexibility to also compromise on decisions. And this has really changed negotiation dynamics in this domain. And I think a key question that research at the moment is facing is, well, you have a strong focus on processes of convergence, on Europeanization, on more integration, but what really happens in a time where you have growing contestation? So you should also look on de-Europeanization. Discussing this with other scholars was quite interesting, that people who have contributed quite substantively to works on Europeanization haven't really thought very much about how to look at de-Europeanization. And there are different questions this raises. On the one hand, you could look at if member states fall back more on national foreign policies. You can also see if they start constraining and limiting discretion of Brussels-based diplomats, or if they rely on different frameworks altogether, like NATO. And then, of course, there's the question of what happens to the culture of cooperation. Do diplomats in Brussels still play according to the rules, or do they question common foreign policy outputs, become more insistent on national foreign policies? What happens to these norms? And there's very little out there really that could give you an idea how is the state of play in European foreign policy making. And I think one interesting group of countries to look at are the Visegrad 4 countries, especially I think Poland and Hungary. As you may know, Poland and Hungary are at the moment under Article 7 proceedings. So this is when there is a concern about serious breaches of European values, as they are specified in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. And this is, relates to norms that you also project through foreign policy to the outside world. So issues like the rule of law, human rights, and democracy. And at the same time, especially Poland and Hungary have also governments, not only populations, but governments that are quite Eurosceptic. So again, it raises the question, how do these governments then behave, or their diplomats, in European foreign policy deliberations? And with a colleague of mine from Poland, we did some preliminary, interviews and have some preliminary information. And what you could see is that on the one hand, it becomes more and more difficult on some issues. We looked on the Middle East peace process to agree on foreign policy outputs like council conclusions, and important issues become more contested. So issues like Jerusalem, labeling guidelines, policy of differentiation, I could talk about more what it is in the question and answer session. They have been questioned by some diplomats from some of these countries. And of course, disagreeing on policy conflict does not have to be equaled with norm erosion. Now you can disagree and play according to the norms. But you also sense a strong feeling among those diplomats that there's something changing, that there's a greater insistence on national interests, also a readiness to question agreed language, which has often been described as sacred, as something you wouldn't touch. And there's a certain erosion, at least in these kind of committees, of trust and confidence in their partners. And even countries that have been quite constructive in the past, they get the feeling of being disadvantaged if they play according to the rules and others don't. So for scholars of norm contestation, these are quite serious signs. One now could, of course, argue why bother? Why, in times of serious external challenges, look into something so soft as foreign policy norms? But if you take the literature seriously, it really suggests that these norms have been something like the oil on the engine of European foreign policy making. And if this oil is not there anymore, then you wonder what happens with this engine. And that can cause serious problems of agreeing on joint policies. Let me very briefly also touch on the second issues, on how scholars have studied external instruments and governance, and what this means for how we look at, or maybe should look at foreign policy decisions today. There are different frameworks through which the European Union addresses its international relations. And if you look at policies like enlargement or also the neighborhood policy, it boils down to certain very basic mechanisms. So on the one hand, you work through incentives and conditionality to facilitate third countries to adapt and reform, to improve, for example, on human rights, on good governance, on democracy. And on the other hand, you have political dialogue. You do it through different instruments. In the enlargement context, of course, you have the big carrot of the membership perspective, but also in the neighborhood policy, through association agreements, countries can move very close to Europe. Think, for example, about Israel, that is part of the European research framework. So you have these kind of incentives. And the focus has been therefore very much on direct governance mechanisms, where the European Union engages directly with a third country. And I think what one should look at more intensely at this very point in time is situations where the European Union works through other actors. I think one way to illustrate it is in the domain of conflict mediation. So the usual kind of literature talks about third-party mediation between two parties in conflict. So party A and B have a conflict, they negotiate, and they invite a third-party mediator to negotiate, to support them in their negotiations and to mediate between them. The literature almost exclusively focuses on situations where the European Union is such a third-party mediator. Whilst if you look at the reality of or universe of cases, there are many more cases where the European Union provides mediation support to others. And why that is so, I can tell you in a nutshell. But just let me briefly contrast the vision of Europe and its neighborhood with, again, the actual reality. So the vision was, or the ambition was, when the European neighborhood policy was developed or launched in 2004, we want a ring of well-governed countries in our neighborhood. And this ring of well-governed countries you can see here in brown, in the brown shade. And if we go today, the economist, as cynical as the economist tends to be, contrasted this vision with a ring of fire or a burning ring of fire, alluding to Johnny Cash's famous song. And in this burning ring of fire, even in the neighborhood, you have countries that are not anymore functioning states. Think about Syria, but also about Libya. It's areas of limited or statehood. In the case of Syria, that would be still even probably too optimistic. And this creates serious problems for direct engagement. Now, you have lack of access. You cannot enter into some domains. You have also certain legal constraints. Think about the European Union's position on Hamas. It cannot directly engage with Hamas, even if it would like to mediate. So it faces certain constraints. And at the same time, direct mediation also often comes at a cost. So you legitimize, for example, problematic actors by engaging directly. It's quite resource intensive. And of course, you often deal with situations where you have mediator complexity. So it's not that the mediator, the parties to the conflict wait for the European Union. You have often multiple mediators who try to be part of the negotiations. And you want to have a mediator focus, because the literature tells you it's not very efficient to operate on the basis of multiple mediators. So governance through intermediaries, through proxies, I think will be more important, and not only in more distant places, but also in some of the neighborhood countries. And I think that also should be an area where research should focus on, and where I definitely want to make a contribution. Of course, an inauguration lecture should end on a positive note. After having talked so much about crises and challenges, it might also be good to remind ourselves that crises and challenges often is also a stimulus for growth. And let's hope that the European Union will be able to seize this potential of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Müller, for your lecture. My name is Lukas Lucic. I'm a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. And my question would pertain to the EU security policy. That is, how does the lack of hard power of the EU directly restrain, hinder, or influence EU's foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis countries that are not afraid to exercise the military might in the EU's neighborhood?
Thank you. And then we have one more spot in our, maybe it's next.
Hello. I'm Hilal. I'm a MICE 2 student here at the Diplomatic Academy. My question is relating to mandates of the EU foreign policy. Why is it that the EU is better equipped to deal with certain situations in certain parts of the world rather than member states who have had a historical influence in these regions? For example, why is it the EU, if the EU were to mediate in the conflict in Libya, for example, why is it better or more efficient for the EU to do so rather than Italy, who had, over the years, a considerable amount of diplomatic capital invested in that country, or France and Mali, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick, your turn.
Is it working?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, I think the first question, as I understood it, relates to the credibility of the European Union and at a situation where it faces itself severe challenges. And I think the research that I could identify that speaks most closely to this set of issues is people who work on external perceptions of the European Union. I was recently involved in a research project where we studied the external perceptions of countries in conflict of the European Union, and that gives you a good idea, how they perceive the European Union and how this maybe also impacts then on its influence. And I think that from the findings that I was involved with the most is that you can see quite diverging effects. So there is a certain concern, for example, when you look at actors like the Palestinians. Now, there was a strong concern that the European Union might disengage from issues of international law, from issues of human rights, and becomes probably a more disinterested, but also maybe a more, what you might call in IR scholarship, a more realist actor. Other side of the conflict, Israel, was feeling that a lot of difficulties that the European Union faces maybe reminds the European Union that the world is differently than depicted in many EU strategic documents, that the European Union maybe wakes up to a realist or more realist world, and that also can improve bilateral relations. So there's not, I think, one impact. It can diverge, and I think it's also filtered through interests and other issues. About the lack of hard power and what kind of limitation this entails, I think, of course, a very important event for the European Union was the Ukraine conflict. It started actually, or not it started now, but the prelude to the conflict was an association agreement. So the European Union playing its usual toolkit and then running for itself, apparently surprisingly, into hard power. I personally think that the Europeans still very much commit to the other big alliance, now NATO, in terms of hard security, and then maybe one should be more concerned about the state of NATO and some developments there than about military capabilities. European military capabilities have been made more for small kind of crisis responses and this kind of set of issues. And that was the intention. Who should mediate? I don't think that the European Union has a monopoly over mediation. There might be situations where individual countries can do so very effectively. I think Germany has done so, for example, in the context of Israel and Lebanon when it came to freeing some soldiers, etc. So I don't think that there's a monopoly, but of course it helps you to grow also in status now if you take on certain mediation challenges.
Thank you. Then we're going to move on to our second batch of questions. We're going to move towards the yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Mansoor Ahmed Khan. I'm Ambassador of Pakistan here in Vienna. Thank you very much. It was a very good presentation on a very sensitive and intricate subject. My question is, how difficult in the current circumstances is for the EU countries to work on a common agenda emanating from its VN? Because while narrating the internal challenges, you indicated that there is a group known as Visegrad group. I think it is also it comprises of the Eurosceptic governments. On the other hand, there are countries who want more and more integration, whether it is security policy, foreign policy, or economic policy. So while these divergent trends or forces are in operation, how difficult it is in the current circumstances for the EU countries to agree and work on a common agenda? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, and then in the back.
In practice, is the EU a state or an international organization?
And one more question, yes, Matteo.
Thank you. My name is Matteo Mirolo. I'm a student here. Brexit, whether soft or hard, will mean that France is the only nuclear weapon-enabled state in the EU. I was wondering if you could comment on what it would change on the interest alignment of the EU member states, and especially France, with regards to the creation of a European army. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick, and I'm going to hand over to you again.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador, for the questions about the question about the Visegrad group and Eurosceptic countries. Sure. On the Visegrad, is it? You hear me better? Great, wonderful. First of all, I think that even though these countries includes Eurosceptic governments, those governments tend to see the value of the European project. So it's not about disengaging from the European project per se. And I think it also matters very much on what kind of policy issues you look at. You can strike compromises on some issues, on others certainly it will be more difficult. And then, of course, there are several ideas out and contemplated how you deal with a situation where, in general, you have some countries that are more pro-integration and others that are very reluctant. And you, for example, some suggest you want a multiple speed, flexible, integrated Europe where you allow some core groups to go ahead and cooperate more. You had just in 2017 now the permanent structured cooperation decided in the realm of defense policy, where almost all countries, but not, I think, Denmark and Malta, and of course not the UK, agreed to move ahead and cooperate more closely. So there, of course, are certain ideas out now on the issue of design. The second question, I think, was about, is the European Union a state or an international organization? And this is a very kind of old debate. I think the usual phrase was it's more than an international organization, but less than a state. And I think most models out there, because there's a scholar of European foreign policy, you are part of a broader set of debates in international relations, and I think the overall quite a broad consensus I would identify is that you look at it as a sui generis actor. So it's not something that we know, and therefore you try to develop this series and factors to explain this that are tailor-made for the European Union. Brexit and the area of defense, I think that when you go through the think tank publications, one area where Brexit is actually seen as something that could lead to more Europe and more integration, then often defense would be one of those issues identified. So there I would think that this is more seen as something that as an enabler in some extent. Of course, one should not forget we don't know yet what will be the format, even with a Brexit, of future cooperation between the UK and the Common Foreign and Security Policy. So that would be also have to be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Patrick. And I think we have easily time for one more round of questions. Hands up, yes.
My name is Gloria. I'm also a student here. Thank you for your lecture. We as students are also very happy to welcome you here as a new professor. And my question would pertain more to theory and to your research. How do you think, after years and years of Europeanization and also research on Europeanization, how can we possibly quantify and qualify de-Europeanizations? What tools can we employ, and what could we potentially expect from such research? Or do you think that we will ever be able to predict also trends in de-Europeanization?
Thank you. No more questions, no more comments? Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Olli. I'm also a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. Just one question. Do you think it's possible that even though EU foreign policy is based on consensus, it is possible for certain powerful member states to employ more of their power to direct EU foreign policy more than smaller EU member states?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I wanted to ask something regarding enlargement and neighborhood policy. So you mentioned earlier that there were certain troubles when EU tools were met with hard power. And do you think in general that those tools and like the kit that the EU has at its disposal is becoming obsolete or stale? And do you think it should be changed? And if yes, what would be your suggestion?
Last chance if anyone wants to add another question, comment. Otherwise, I'm going to hand the word back to Patrick.
First of all, about the potential research agenda on de-Europeanization, I think, of course, the usual research project would be to first come up with a framework where you identify core indicators. Now that this is what I would need to see to know that we are dealing with de-Europeanization. And there are works on the way, so I think it's just a question of time and not too much for this kind of research tools to develop. And then, of course, you deal with quite extensive set of empirical issues. Now you deal with still 28 and then probably 27 EU member states. You deal with a lot of different foreign policy issues, geographic priorities. So it takes a lot, I think, of cumulative work to establish, to work through these things and then to identify trends. But this was not very different from when Europeanization research was emerging in the 2000s. No? So I think it's, of course, it's a quite extensive research agenda, but that's also something good, especially for students, to look forward to, because there are important issues to work on. The question about smaller and larger EU member states, I think that some small EU member states have played quite an impressive role in some areas of EU foreign policy. If you think about Scandinavian countries and the civilian aspects of the defense policy, they have been very instrumental. Also, Austria has been very instrumental on some issues. I think anti-landmine would be one of them. So I think if small countries focus their efforts, they can be really punching, if you want, over their weight. But I think what the larger countries still have the advantage is that they have a lot of breadth. So they have a lot of expertise on many issues, and that is quite difficult, I think, to replicate for any small member state. But I wouldn't think that you need on all issues a large country taking leadership. I think some small countries have done so quite effectively. The question about the European neighbourhood policy is really, you asked so many questions and so many very relevant questions. I think that my feeling here is that the European neighbourhood policy emerged very much out of the enlargement policy. So you hope to be able to replicate what you have achieved through enlargement in the neighbourhood. But you ran into issues that were quite different. You didn't have a member state perspective, and countries that want to always become part of the European Union, you also couldn't offer it. And then, of course, you're dealing with countries that are also not very democratic often. And then a lot of calculations change. Now, when you work through certain incentives that benefit the whole population, you would hope you have an actor that makes a calculus in a similar way. No? But if you have elites that are caring very much about themselves, if you have situations of state capture, you run into certain troubles. I think also people, for example, in the mediation literature of direct mediation of the European Union, they also write a lot about working through economic incentives. I think in many situations this does not make a whole lot of sense. Think, for example, an instance of South Sudan, a very impoverished country with elites that care mainly about their own benefits. I would say it's very difficult to work through this kind of tools. I think here with targeted sanctions, with other instruments, you are better placed. But you really have to look at the country and the situation. And I think European neighbourhood policy has gone through revisions. You have left an approach where you wanted to have a kind of one-size-fits-all formula. And I would imagine that the discussions go further in these directions. And we maybe see some more creative efforts.
Patrick, many thanks. And allow me to say a few words at the end as well. It's been, I think, 10 years. I've been here now for 10 years. I can't believe it. And before that, there was no chair for political science. There was only the Fulbright chair, and which is for every year is new. And we have a new arrival now, Professor Bartlett. Welcome to Vienna on that occasion as well. And then I arrived as the fourth chair. And if we go back historically more, then the very first chair sitting there, Professor Werner Neudeck, started a few years ago, and then came Professor Gerhard Leubel in law, and then Tom Rowe in history. And now we have a fifth one. In addition to that, we also have postdoctoral fellows. Some of those are here. We have a doctoral program. That's all fairly new as well. So it really shows you that the institution is moving ahead, and I really think it's moving ahead in the right direction. And saying that, I want to thank quite a few people here. When it comes to your position and creating the position, there was a process. There were lots of people involved. Obviously, I want to thank our director very much for all of his input and everything that he's done, because for people like me, it's obviously an easy thing. I go to the director, anything that I want has financial implications. I just say, I want. In that way, I actually feel like a child at Christmas today that you're here. So that's really wonderful news. I want to thank our deputy director, Susanne Kepler-Schlesinger. She's been very much involved in terms of negotiating all of this process. I also want to emphasize that the University of Vienna helped us a lot and was very cooperative. Rector Engel, Vice Rector Heinz Fassmann at the time, who's obviously moved on to even doing something greater than being Vice Rector at the University of Vienna. So in that way, I think, Patrick, you're very good news for me, one more political scientist, but most definitely for this institution, and in very formal ways in that way too. I really want to welcome you to this institution, and I look forward to working with you a lot. On that note, I think let's give him a big applause for the talk, for being here.